Hello and welcome. My name is Walid Mehr. I am a Microsoft technical trainer here to walk through the Microsoft SC-300 Identity and Access Administrator Associate course with you. Let's imagine you're logging into your company's portal on Monday morning and you type in your password. Maybe it's the one you've used for years or a clever phrase you think no one could guess. But here's the reality. The attackers are betting on that. In 2024, password-based attacks have reached a record high, with phishing responsible for over 70% of data breaches worldwide. Every day, cybercriminals exploit weak or reuse passwords, and even sophisticated organizations have fallen victims to credential theft. But the problem isn't just passwords. Even some multi-factor authentication methods like SMS codes are now being bypassed by attackers using SIM swapping and phishing kits. In fact, thousands of multi-factor authentication fatigue attacks are recorded daily, where users are tricked into approving fraudulent sign-ins. So, if traditional authentication is failing, what is the answer? You're about to explore Azure authentication methods in this session. You'll learn how users can sign in, discover how some of these options from passwordless to multi-factor help secure identities, simplify access, and support modern security needs in Microsoft Entra. Get ready to see how flexible authentication keeps your organization safe and productive. Let's get started. As a part of the sign-in experience, users have multiple options that they can use in Microsoft Entra ID to authenticate themselves. Let's have a look at how they can be categorized. For instance, we have been using passwords since the dawn of the internet. That means it's a convenient way for us to work with. However, it's the worst form of authentication method that we have, simply because it's hard for users to keep remembering their passwords if they were to ask them to change. Attackers find easier way to break these passwords or guess your passwords. So we don't want to rely on just passwords. We want to do a step better than that. So what's better than passwords? Well, embed other sorts of multi-factors into it. Things like using an SMS or getting a voice call. Now that is good, but like I mentioned, a lot of the attackers are looking to find ways in spoofing your SIMs or your phones, and they can get away with making some sort of malicious activities around your mobile phones. So something better than that would be to include other sorts of authentication methods like the Authenticator app that we have that can help us send notifications and ask you to approve them, or using a software token or a hardware token in your environment. Now, even better than that would be using some options that we have available in our environment to do passwordless authentication, where a user doesn't have to type in their password at all to begin their journey into working with authentication with any resource and get authorized to work with their resources. Now, with passwordless options, it makes it easier for me on the go while I'm typing this in, while I'm in public, in front of other people. If I'm worried about any keylogging attacks, if I'm worried about shoulder surfers, again, I can be rest assured nobody will ever see my password because I'm using one of the methods like the Authenticator to sign in simply based on the notifications that's sent onto my phone. Now, before we go and have a look at some of these, just as a quick pointer to understand that why are we getting loads of different breaches in our environment without or having MFA or having MFA fatigue, where people are being asked to just approve things and they're looking at approving without understanding what they're doing. Simply because if you're asking people to look at just working with password, it might be very, very convenient for them, but it's low or weak for us in security. We add a lot of different factors for them to work with. It becomes very secure, but inconvenient for people to perform this. So they try and avoid this or perform this as quickly as they can so they can carry on working. Now, to avoid all of these issues, we want to make sure that we can find better ways to ensure that it's easy and convenient for people, and again, very, very secure method for us to work with. And this is where we can bring in passwordless authentication more and more in our environments. Now, there are different authentication methods that are available for us to look at on Entra. So let's have a quick jump back onto the Entra portal and have a quick overview of some of these options. I'm back onto my Entra portal on entra.microsoft.com, and just on the blade of my Entra portal, if I can scroll down to authentication methods. Now, within these authentication methods, again, it depends on what you are looking to configure, what you see more secure for your organization. You can configure all of these options to work with. Now, it's nice to see there's a documentation here that talks a little bit more about these authentication method policies that you can look into understanding how they work and what you can do with them. And also to understand a little bit more in terms of what is a better way to implement some of these authentication methods to make sure that you understand which one of these options you can use for your primary authentication method and secondary authentication method if you were to implement this in your environment, and options that are not available for you to use as primary authentication methods. For instance, just as a quick overview of this, I do not see options to apply emails in one of the lists over here. However, if I go back to my authentication methods, I can see email one-time passcode is available for me. Again, not necessarily a method I can implement for my primary authentication, so something to bear in mind. Again, maybe used for other features. So if I click on that, again, it tells me right over here on what I can do in terms of using this particular detail. So if you're not sure, you could always go back into this and have a look at if an authentication method is designed for multi-factor authentication or it's used for another service. Now, let's take a step back out of this. Apart from choosing multiple authentication methods, one question that could come to mind: how do I ensure that a user is working with a particular authentication method that's more secure for them in an environment? Now, we can look at the settings under my authentication methods. And if I go into the blade for the authentication methods and click on settings right here, now right at the bottom of the screen, we have a system preferred multi-factor authentication as an option available for us to look at. Now, this is where we can go and look into implementing an option such as Microsoft Managed, where I leave Microsoft in this case to define if a user is trying to log in to a resource, choose the most secure method that is available at that point in time for that user to implement. Now, if that's the case, the Microsoft will automatically start looking at, for a user, multiple authentication method policies that are available for them, which one will sit a bit more higher than the other, so they can use and implement that for you to look at. Now, if you're not so sure, we can always come back in here and click on the documentation to understand how that looks like and how that works. So if I scroll down to the bottom of this document and have a look at some of the details here, it explains what this particular feature looks like, and also gives me a quick response to a question saying, well, what does Microsoft do in terms of determining the secure methods? And it gives you a list of how they can be looked at in terms of being secure, and you can see how it will prefer or choose one over the other depending on what you're trying to do and what authentication methods you've enabled in your environment. So it's a nice option to look at. Now, let's have a quick discussion about some of these authentication methods that we have, and just to kind of get your head around on how they work. First off, we have FIDO. Now, FIDO2 is a fast identity online that is used to log in or authenticate users without having to type in their passwords. And they can do that by simply using a hardware USB dongle to connect in, or a FIDO key to plug in. Typically, a user will plug this key into the device, again, depending on if it's a hardware version of it. They plug this into the device, and once they plug it in, this will start sending a message to your Entra in the backend to suggest that there is a key that's been plugged in to authenticate this user. Now, Entra would typically look at that key to ensure if this key is good. Before it does anything, it might require the user to provide some additional details, and it'll bounce back to ask, hey, can you provide me with some details, just to ensure that this key wasn't lost and somebody hasn't taken that key and tried to plug into your device. It might ask the user to provide some additional details, things like biometrics, thumbprint, or a PIN to type in along with the key. Now, once they do that and provide that information, this detail goes back into Entra to verify all the details are correct. And once that is completed, Entra then authenticates this user and validates this user to the device. In the whole scenario, there is no password required. The user is simply using their FIDO key and logging in to their setup. Now, the FIDO keys can be used without the username and password, and it can be just an external security key that you can plug into your device. It could also be a platform key that you can use nowadays with most of your modern devices, like your laptops or smartphones, will have some of these security modules built into them using solutions like Windows Hello, or on your mobile devices like your Face ID or Touch ID, or even using biometrics on some of the devices could work as a FIDO key in your environment as well. Now, apart from that, we can use Authenticator app, which is very easily downloaded by people on their mobile phone and configured to log in to your company's portal or company's settings. Once you have your Authenticator app configured against your profile, you should be able to use this in a couple of different methods. With your Authenticator app, you have an option to get an OAuth code that you can use, or you can get a push notification that can come through to your device. And depending on the type of method that you're using in your environment, you'll either go into using a code that's available for you to use, typically generated for 30 seconds to 60 seconds in an environment, and you can type that in to authenticate yourself. However, you could also use the notifications where a user tries to sign in and they are prompted to type in a particular number and approve yes to sign in or confirm that they are attempting to log in or authenticate themselves using an Authenticator app. Now, it's important to understand the difference between both of these options. Obviously, if you're looking at using a notification or push notification in your environment, you must have some sort of a reception on your device. So if I am in a remote location with no good internet connection, or not being able to access the local networks for any reason, for me, the push notifications might not work. I won't be able to receive any signals. I won't be able to receive notifications, won't be able to approve them and send them back. However, in that scenario where I'm remote and I have no connection, I could still use my verification code that gets generated on my device. So it could be worthwhile understanding the implementation of both these solutions in an environment where you are working. Another method that we can use for authentication is Windows Hello. Now, Windows Hello is amazing because it allows users to authenticate themselves to the device and lets them log into the resources that they're trying to connect to. Again, in this method, the user doesn't need to type in their password. They can simply log in to the device or authenticate to the device by using facial recognition, or maybe a thumbprint scan, or simply typing in a PIN. Now, this typically works based on a secure chip that's available on your motherboard, typically known as the Trusted Platform module. And it's designed to hold all the encryption keys for you. Now, most of the modern devices with a secure processor might have that built into them. For the majority of the other devices, you would have a separate chip on your motherboard called the Trusted Platform module. Now, typically in the back end, as the user tries to authenticate themselves by typing in their PIN or using biometric, this generates a series of keys, which are asymmetric keys that it uses to authenticate to your provider. In our case, This could be Microsoft Entra ID, or on-prem, you might have your Active Directory where you're authenticating to. Now, as a result of that, it bounces back with a token that's been offered to the device, which simply in return verifies the user that is logging onto that device. Now, once the user tries to log into a resource from that device, that simply goes back to the token that's been generated by the identity provider to simply authenticate the user to log into that resource. Now, this makes it much more secure for a user to work within an environment simply because they're not providing their password or their identity details to log in and to access their resources. Now, another method to log into your environment or authenticate yourself would be to use certification-based authentication. Now, the process of certification-based authentication looks very similar to a lot of the other authentication methods that we have spoken about in the previous sessions. Typically, the journey begins with a user trying to log into a resource or connect to an application. In our scenario, the user goes onto the device and tries to gain access to an application. The first thing the application would do would bounce this user down and bounce it to Entra saying, hey, Entra, can you authenticate this user for me so I know if I can let this user in and authorize based on the access level that they need. Now, as soon as Entra receives this, Entra prompts the user to type in. You see a small dialog box pop into your screen to say, hey, start with typing in your username. So we know who you are. Now, if Entra has authenticated the user already in the past, that would be slightly different. If the user hasn't been authenticated to Entra and Entra doesn't know the user, then the user simply types in their username, and Entra goes and check if it can find this user, either within its own realm or if it's coming from an external realm to allow them to log in. Now, once that happens, Entra goes and checks if this user particularly has their certification-based authentication enabled for them. And if that's the case, it prompts the user back into saying, hey, do you want to sign in using the certification or certification-based authentication? If that's the case, provide me with a certificate. And this is where the user is going to be able to select, if they have more than one, select a certificate that they're using to sign in with. And once the user provides that certificate, the Entra simply goes back and validates if that certificate is current, hasn't been expired, hasn't been tampered with, is been presented to Entra from the actual user themselves. Once all that is completed as a verification, Entra simply completes the sign-in process and allows the user to log into the device. Now, again, this is a very, very common part or very common process that you see if you are using certification-based authentication in your environment. Typically, you'll see companies using phishing-resistant authentication methods by using frameworks like X509 in your environment to work with certification-based authentication. Now, apart from looking at different authentication methods that we spoke about, your organization might also want to understand how many people are using some of these methods, which methods are more popular. If there was an issue with one of the methods that people have or you have implemented in your organization, how can you monitor who has them, who uses them, and if you want to enforce them to use different methods, and all that information. Now, we can monitor this in our environment if you were to jump into your Entra portal. So let's have a look at that on the portal one more time. So I'm back onto my entra.microsoft.com, and I am looking on my blade under authentication methods, and I am back onto the part where we can see different authentication method policies. Now, just under the blade, under monitoring, I could simply go into my activities right over here, and I can monitor different things that are going on in my environment. Now, under the monitoring part, I can simply see the registration details on who has registered with different authentication methods in my environment, and I can track them. Now, in my demo portal, I don't necessarily have that many people that are authenticating or using different authentication methods. So again, that data might look completely different for you in your environment. And you can see I have a list of different authentication methods listed. Not all of them are being used in my demo, but hopefully in your environment, you'll see a lot more than what I have in terms of data on your screen. Now, I could simply go and filter through each one of them if I needed to. I can click on them and find out who those users are and see some more details around them if there was a need for me to do that. I can simply click on the user registration details and see some more, which we'll do in a minute. Now, before I go into that, I could always track the usage of this as well to see who logs in, how many times they're asked to authenticate, and what methods they use to authenticate as their primary or secondary authentication methods. I can track all of that information down, all by simply clicking on the usage on the activity tab. Again, there are some graphs and nice details available for you to look at. If you are looking to manage some of this would be a nice place to look at the details. Now, if I jump onto the next option available for me, which is the user registration details, this is where I can see a list of all my users in my Entra and find out how many people are registered, capable of doing multi-factor authentication, has a secondary method to use. If they're looking to reset their password, are they capable of doing that? So all this information is visible for me straight away. So if someone comes back and complains about a particular issue that they can't do MFA, or they don't have different methods available, or they can't log in they can't do their password reset, this could be a nice place to start your troubleshooting to see exactly what that user has registered. What methods do they have? Can they authenticate themselves using that? Can they go into doing multi-factor authentication? And this should show them that if they're capable of doing that based on different authentication methods they have registered. And if not, then simply asking them to going into my signins.microsoft.com and registering another method could resolve that issue. With that, we conclude this part of the session. We encourage you to review the reference modules, check your knowledge with the additional study materials, watch other videos in this course, or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.